The morning sun crept over the rust-colored hills of Red Rock, Texas, casting a long shadow over the dusty pickup truck parked in front of the county courthouse. Inside, Hank Morrison sat in the driver's seat, both hands resting on the cracked leather wheel. He didn't get out right away. Instead, he stared at the chipped brick facade of the building, as if it might offer him some reason to go back home and forget this whole damn idea. But home didn't feel like home anymore. Not since Margaret passed. The old farmhouse they built together, nail by nail, season after season, had grown cold and too quiet. It had been nearly 2 years, but the silence still echoed louder than any tractor or storm ever had. At 68, Hank figured he should have found peace and solitude by now. But peace wasn't something that just arrived with time. It had to be earned, or maybe rediscovered, and that's what today was about. He opened the door, the hinge groaning like a tired old man, and stepped into the dry heat. His boots crunched against gravel as he crossed the lot toward the courthouse steps, the brim of his worn Stetson shading eyes that had seen too much dust, too much death, and too many summers without rain. Inside, the auction room was a far cry from the dramatic courtroom scenes you'd see in movies. No gavels banging or fiery speeches. Just a handful of locals sitting on metal folding chairs, chewing toothpicks and talking about cattle prices. At the front, a small podium stood beside a whiteboard with 6 property listings scribbled in faded marker. The fourth one down read, Parcel number 4, Elkhorn Ranch, 480 acres, starting bid $500. Hank felt something tighten in his chest when he saw the name, Elkhorn Ranch. He hadn't heard those words aloud in over 40 years, not since his father used to speak them in hushed tones on the porch, usually after 2 fingers of bourbon and 1 too many regrets. Back then, Elkhorn was just a story Hank barely understood, some dusty piece of land west of town, a place his dad had worked drilling test wells before the big oil companies swept through and made everything hush-hush. The land was trouble, he'd said, cursed, swallowed up in lawsuits and bad deals that never saw daylight. But it was also where his father had learned the difference between working with your hands and selling out with them. The auctioneer, a round-bellied man named Reggie Stokes, cleared his throat and tapped the mic that wasn't even plugged in. All right, folks, let's get to it. Parcel number 1. The bidding moved slowly, like molasses in January. Hank barely heard the numbers. His mind kept drifting back to that name, Elkhorn Ranch, how it lingered like an old wound you thought had scarred over, only to start bleeding when the weather turned. When Reggie finally reached parcel number 4, the room shifted. Folks leaned back in their chairs. Some even chuckled under their breath. And now, Reggie drawled, Elkhorn Ranch. 480 acres of, well, let's just say it's mostly cactus and bad luck. Starting bid is $500. No hands went up, not a single twitch. Someone in the back whispered, Ain't nothing out there but rattlers and bad memories. Hank stood. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor caught every head in the room. He walked to the bidding area like a man heading into a dust storm, slow, steady, unbothered by the sideways looks. I'll bid, he said. Reggie blinked. Mr. Morrison, you sure? You know what place we're talking about? Hank nodded once. I know exactly what it is. He didn't explain, didn't need to, but the truth was simpler than anyone could have guessed. This wasn't a land grab or a business decision. It was a memory buried under dust and dry soil, one that had kept Hank awake more nights than he cared to admit. He remembered sitting on his father's lap, hearing stories about that ranch, about how he'd helped drill there back in '71, just before some corporate deal went sideways, and the whole place got sealed off tighter than a bank vault. There was pride in those stories, and bitterness, and something else Hank had never been able to name. The auctioneer looked around the room. Any other bids? He asked, more out of habit than hope. Silence. Reggie waited a few seconds, then scribbled a note and clapped his hands. Elkhorn Ranch sold to Hank Morrison for $500. There were murmurs, some confused, some amused. One man near the door muttered, Poor bastard's lost his marbles. But Hank didn't hear any of it. He was already halfway out the door, the deed folded in his back pocket like a prayer. Back in his truck, he sat for a moment, letting the engine idle as he stared down Main Street. The sun was higher now, baking the pavement into waves. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train moaned like an old ghost. $500. That's what it took to buy a forgotten ranch and stir up a lifetime's worth of buried history. He didn't know yet what he'd find out there, if the house still stood, if the land had anything left to give. But he knew this. Some things were worth more than what they cost. Some things needed to be reclaimed, not for profit, but for peace. And behind him, Red Rock kept on forgetting. But Hank wasn't going there to forget. He was going to remember. The morning sun had barely crested over the distant buttes when Hank Morrison turned the key in his battered 1987 Dodge pickup. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught, grumbling like an old hound forced out of bed. He eased it into gear and turned off the gravel shoulder onto County Road 47, leaving behind Red Rock and whatever pieces of the past still clung to that sleepy town. Elkhorn Ranch lay 13 miles west, a stretch of cracked blacktop giving way to dirt roads, then barely there tracks where tumbleweed outnumbered street signs. Hank rolled down the window as the heater wheezed into uselessness. The desert air carried the bitter tang of mesquite and dust, a scent he hadn't smelled in decades, but one his bones remembered. He didn't play the radio. He never did these days. The closer he got, the more the land changed. Yuccas gave way to brittle patches of thorn brush, and the soil turned from rust red to a pale, ashen gray. Nothing grew here, not since the 70s. Folks in town said the land had been cursed ever since the old oil claims dried up and the lawsuits started flying. Fires had burned through parts of the ranch, and a few said they'd heard strange noises at night, unexplained lights even. Hank didn't believe in ghost stories, but he believed in scars, the kind that didn't show up on skin. By the time the ranch's sagging gate came into view, his pickup had picked up a fresh coat of dust. The gate was chained shut, with a faded "no trespassing" sign flapping loose. Hank climbed out, boots crunching over cracked gravel. The padlock was old, rusted to hell. He pulled the county-issued key from his pocket and gave it a try. It stuck, groaned, and finally gave with a click that echoed louder than it should have in the dead silence of the land. He pushed the gate open. It screamed on its hinges. Driving up the access road, Hank could see the ranch house in the distance, if you could call it that. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back. Window frames were either missing or boarded up. The porch leaned hard to one side, and a piece of gutter dangled like a noose from the edge. The barn wasn't much better, collapsed halfway in on itself, with the carcass of a tractor just visible inside. Elkhorn Ranch looked like it had given up a long time ago. Hank parked beside the house and stepped out, hands on hips, surveying what $500 had bought him. Around him, the wind kicked up dust in short, angry bursts. It whistled through the busted siding and sent a tumbleweed bouncing against the foundation like it was trying to escape. He walked the perimeter first. The wellhead was dry and crusted over with calcium deposits. A rusted windmill lay half-buried nearby, its blades long torn away. He kicked at the cracked earth with the toe of his boot. Nothing but dust and stone. Still, he didn't feel discouraged. Inside the house, the air was thick with the scent of rot and old wood. The floors creaked under his weight, and he moved slowly, testing each step like a man unsure if the ground would hold. Wallpaper peeled like dead skin from the walls. In what used to be the living room, a yellowed couch sat beneath a broken window, its stuffing spilling out like guts. In the kitchen, a mouse scurried across the sink and disappeared behind a fallen cabinet. Hank chuckled to himself. At least something was still living here. He set his canvas duffel down on the kitchen counter and got to work. The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm. He swept out rooms, pried open doors swollen shut with years of weather, and hauled out garbage by the armload. A broken cabinet, a warped mattress, a dusty box of Reader's Digests from 1984. The front porch gave way under his boot at one point, dropping him a good foot into the crawl space. He muttered a curse and pulled himself out, brushing off dirt like it was just another Tuesday. By dusk, he'd cleared a corner of the front room and laid out his bedroll. He set a Coleman lantern on an overturned crate and fired it up, its warm glow casting long shadows across the torn wallpaper. Outside, the wind howled like a freight train in the distance. The ranch creaked and groaned like it was remembering how to breathe. Hank sat on the porch steps, what was left of them, and pulled a tin of beans from his duffel. He ate in silence, watching the stars poke holes in the dark sky one by one. This wasn't a place most people would choose to sleep, but Hank wasn't most people. He'd slept in drilling rigs out in the Permian Basin when he was 20, eaten worse food than canned beans, and shared tents with men who hadn't bathed in weeks. Compared to that, Elkhorn Ranch was practically the Hilton. As he scraped the last of the beans from the can, he caught a scent he hadn't smelled in decades, creosote and crude oil. It drifted on the wind like a whisper, faint and uncertain. He stood, sniffed again. Nothing. Just dry air and ghost stories. Still, he glanced toward the far edge of the property where the land dipped into a low basin surrounded by shale outcroppings, a spot his father used to call the belly, the place where the ground looked like it was holding its breath. "You'd be surprised what's buried under your boots," his father once told him, back when Hank was just a boy riding shotgun in a work truck that smelled of diesel and sweat. Hank finished his dinner and tossed the can into a sack. Back inside, he zipped into his bedroll, the lantern still burning beside him. He lay there listening, not to the creaks or the distant coyotes, but to the past, whispering through the dry boards and empty halls. Elkhorn Ranch wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memory, and Hank Morrison was ready to confront every last one of them. The Texas sun was already climbing when Hank pulled the barn doors open the next morning. The hinges shrieked like a wounded animal, metal grinding against metal, echoing into the stillness of Elkhorn Ranch. The place hadn't been touched in decades. Dust blanketed everything like ash after a fire, and the stale air inside smelled of old hay, rust, and forgotten years. A beam of light sliced through a hole in the roof, illuminating a pile of half-collapsed crates and what looked like a workbench buried beneath a mess of rotting canvas and spiderwebs. Hank moved slow, deliberate. Years of farming had taught him not to rush into old structures. He took each step like it might be the one that sent the floor buckling. But something about the barn felt sturdier than it looked. Beneath the decay, the bones were solid, like the place was holding its breath, waiting to be remembered. He brushed the tarp off the workbench and paused. Underneath, laid out like a fossil waiting to be unearthed, were tools he hadn't seen in over 40 years, rusted core samplers, steel casing wrenches, a broken soil auger. His eyes narrowed. These weren't just general farm tools. These were oil field relics. And they weren't just thrown together. Someone had cared for them once, arranged them like they had purpose, like they were used for something specific. In the corner of the bench, tucked beneath a warped clipboard, was a leather-bound notebook, the kind you'd find in a rig supervisor's coat pocket. Hank picked it up gently. The leather cracked under his fingers. He opened it. The handwriting inside was faded but unmistakably technical. Notations on soil density, stratigraphy layers, and depth estimates. There were coordinates, dates, observations, and at the top of one page, written in a shaky but familiar hand, basin depth near 90 feet. Pressure readings suggest possible accumulation. Further testing needed. Hank sat down on an overturned feed bucket and stared at the page. He could feel the hair on his arms stand up. He recognized the phrasing, the shorthand. It was the kind of note his father used to scribble in the margins of old field reports. His heart thudded in his chest, slow and deep. He flipped further into the notebook. There were sketches of a rudimentary drilling rig. One entry was dated 1972. Another was marked with a red X and the words, West Ridge Anomaly. This wasn't some farmer's idle curiosity. Someone had done serious groundwork here, decades ago. Hank rubbed the back of his neck, the same way he used to when his rig crew brought him a set of logs that didn't make sense. The signs were here, subtle but unmistakable. He stepped outside the barn, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. The dry wind blew across the field, carrying with it the smell of old mesquite and dust. He turned slowly, looking out across the ranch, trying to reframe what he thought he knew. What if this place wasn't just forgotten? What if it had been buried, intentionally? His boots crunched against gravel as he walked toward the western edge of the property, the same ridge that was marked in the notebook. The ground was cracked and brittle, but something about the formation caught his eye. The striations in the rock, the sediment layers, the way water might have once flowed here, pooling before disappearing into the earth. damn," Hank muttered under his breath. "This ain't just dead land." He needed a second pair of eyes, someone who could look at this without the burden of memory clouding judgment, someone who knew the land like he did, maybe even better. That afternoon, Hank pulled out his old flip phone and scrolled through the sparse contacts. He found the number under TB and hit dial. Tom Burley answered on the third ring. "If this is another solar panel salesman, I'm hanging up." Hank chuckled. "It's not. It's Hank." A pause, then a warm burst of laughter. "Hank Morrison? Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard that voice since the Reagan administration. I could use a visit, Tom. Found something out here I think you might want to see." Tom lived just outside of Lubbock these days, retired from the State Geological Survey, and mostly kept to himself, working on his garden and arguing politics with himself over the radio. But he was still sharp as hell, and curious by nature. By dusk, Tom's dusty SUV rolled onto Elkhorn Ranch. The vehicle groaned to a stop, and the door creaked open. Tom stepped out, wearing a straw hat and a shirt 2 sizes too big. He looked older, hell, they both did, but his eyes still had that spark, that itch for answers. "Well," Tom said, taking in the barn and the shattered windows of the main house, "you sure know how to pick 'em." "I didn't pick it. It picked me," Hank replied. They shook hands, firm and familiar. Hank led him straight to the barn. It didn't take long for Tom to flip through the notebook and whistle low. "Whoever did this wasn't just poking around." "My old man worked this land back in the day," Hank said. "He never talked much about it, but these notes, they remind me of him." Tom nodded, flipping a few pages. "See this here?" He pointed to the X on the west ridge. "This kind of anomaly doesn't show up unless there's something disrupting the subsurface. Could be a pocket, a dome, maybe even a trap." "You think it's oil?" Hank asked quietly. Tom looked up at him, then back at the ridge in the distance. "I think you might be sitting on something worth a whole lot more than a tax lien sale." They sat on the tailgate of Hank's truck as the sky turned gold, then orange, then deep blue. Tom rolled a toothpick between his teeth. "You ever think about why nobody wanted this land, Hank? Why it went untouched for decades?" Hank nodded. "I figured folks were just superstitious. Called it cursed. Said the earth here swallows dreams." "Maybe," Tom said. "Or maybe someone wanted it forgotten, long enough for the paperwork to rot and the truth to get buried." The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass in dry whispers. Hank stared out toward the ridge, his thoughts a tangle of memory, suspicion, and dawning realization. "Hell of a way to spend retirement," he muttered. Tom grinned. "You always did like the hard way." They clinked enamel mugs of black coffee in the dark, 2 old men staring out across a field that had once been written off by everyone else, but maybe not for the reasons they'd thought. And somewhere, beneath the cracked soil and brittle rock, the land was holding on to its secret. Not much longer. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Hank heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He looked up from the chicken wire he was mending to see a sleek silver SUV crawling its way up the rutted driveway of Elkhorn Ranch, kicking up a trail of dust behind it like a storm front. It was a strange sight, too clean, too polished, too out of place for a place like Red Rock. The contrast was almost comical. That vehicle didn't belong anywhere near a half-collapsed barn or a sun-scorched windmill. Hank wiped his hands on his jeans and narrowed his eyes as the SUV came to a stop near the rusted cattle gate. The engine cut off, and the driver's door opened. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd taken a wrong turn on her way to a high-rise boardroom. Mid-30s, hair pulled back into a sleek twist, wearing a crisp cream blouse tucked into slacks that had never seen a day of dirt. Her heels clicked sharply on the gravel as she approached, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched perfectly on her nose. She looked like someone who'd never walked a mile without air conditioning. "Mr. Morrison," she called out as she neared, offering a dazzling smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's me," Hank replied, voice low, steady. He didn't move from where he stood. His hat shaded most of his face, but his eyes watched her like a hawk tracking a rattlesnake. She extended a hand. "Dana Quinn. I represent a firm focused on environmental land stewardship. We've been monitoring parcels across the county for potential conservation partnerships. May I speak with you for a moment?" Hank shook her hand, lightly. It was one of those handshakes that felt more like an obligation than a gesture. He'd met enough people in his time to know when someone was selling sunshine while hiding the storm behind their back. "Go ahead," he said, crossing his arms. "I'm listening." Dana smiled again and opened the clipboard. "Elkhorn Ranch is of particular interest to us. It lies adjacent to a critical migratory corridor, and there's potential for a wildlife buffer zone that could benefit a number of protected species. We'd like to purchase the property outright and manage it as a private conservation easement." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think buzzards and jackrabbits were on anyone's protection list." Dana let out a soft laugh. "You'd be surprised. Even the most rugged land has ecological value, and we're prepared to offer you $25,000 for the property." Hank didn't flinch, but inside he let the number settle. 50 times what he'd paid. No inspection, no negotiation. Just a smooth offer tied up in corporate-friendly language. He didn't like it. "Is that so?" he said slowly. "Seems like a mighty generous offer for a patch of dirt everybody's been avoiding since Nixon was in office." Dana's smile faltered for a breath. Just a breath, but Hank caught it. "Our firm believes in proactive stewardship," she replied, adjusting her sunglasses. "Sometimes that means acquiring land before its ecological value is compromised." Hank glanced around at the brittle scrub, the rusted-out tractor, leaning like a drunk against the barn, the cracked soil that hadn't tasted rain in weeks. "Looks pretty compromised already." She didn't reply to that. "What company did you say you're with again?" Hank asked. Dana hesitated a split second longer than she should have. "Clearview Environmental Services. We're under contract with several foundations and agencies." "Uh-huh." He stepped forward just once. Not in an aggressive way, but with the weight of someone who'd spent his life digging into hard ground and harder truths. "Tell me something, Ms. Quinn. Y'all offer 50 times value for every dirt patch you think has a few squirrels living in it." She hesitated again, then shifted. "Let's just say we prioritize based on strategic value." Hank looked at her long and hard. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't a politician, but he'd dealt with enough oil reps in his younger days to know when someone was blowing smoke through a smile. Her heels didn't leave scuff marks, but her words did. "No offense," he said, "but I'm not selling, especially not today, not for that." Dana nodded slowly, professionally. She closed her clipboard, her voice still friendly, but cooler now. "Well, the offer stands for the next 2 weeks. After that, our attention may shift elsewhere." Hank gave a tight nod. "I won't keep you waiting." She turned to leave, but paused halfway back to her SUV. "You might want to think twice about spending too much time here, Mr. Morrison. Desert places have long memories, and short patience." The comment was delivered with a gentle smile, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. Hank didn't say a word, just watched her get in the SUV, throw it into reverse, and disappear in a plume of dust. When the silence returned, it felt heavier than before. That night, Hank sat on the porch of the ranch house, the old rocking chair creaking beneath him, the stars just starting to bloom in the sky. The wind stirred the dry mesquite and whispered through the busted fence line. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a tin mug and thought back to the clipboard, the $25,000, the way Dana Quinn had talked about squirrels, while standing on land that hadn't seen wildlife bigger than a field mouse in years. Something didn't sit right. He thought about the tools he'd found in the shed, the rusted drill bits, the markings etched by hand. His daddy had drilled dry holes and hit pay dirt in his time, and Hank had learned to tell the difference between real intent and professional theater. No one bought up land like this for butterflies. He stood and stretched, then walked the perimeter of the barn one more time, flashlight in hand. The quiet here wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As he shut the barn door and latched it, a cold gust rolled through, unseasonably sharp for a Red Rock night. Hank paused, listened. Nothing, just the whisper of dry leaves. And yet, he felt watched. Back in the house, he locked up and double-checked the windows, something he hadn't done the night before. Then he went to his desk, pulled out a yellowed notepad, and jotted a single line. Find out who really owns Clearview. because whatever Dana Quinn was selling, it wasn't about birds or rabbits, and Hank Morrison wasn't about to let go of something that was starting to feel bigger than he'd bargained for. The sun was just beginning to cast its pale gold light over the parched hills when Hank heard the familiar rumble of Tom Burley's pickup winding up the dirt path toward the ranch. He stepped off the porch, wiping his hands on an old rag, and gave a half wave as his old friend parked next to the barn. Tom climbed out, holding a metal case and 2 thermoses. "Figured we could use a strong cup before we start poking around in the earth," he said, tossing one to Hank. "Appreciate it," Hank replied, cracking a grin. "You still take yours black as sin?" "Only way I know how." The 2 men settled at the back of Hank's truck, flipping open the tailgate to use it as a makeshift bench. They sipped in silence for a moment, the kind only longtime friends could share. Tom finally broke it. "So, you really think there's something out here?" Hank nodded slowly. "I don't know what to think, but those old tools, the way the soil fractures around the well site, it's too familiar to ignore." Tom had worked 3 decades as a geologist for various outfits, most of them fly-by-night operations that came and went with the boom-bust rhythm of the oil world. He knew the signs, and after a full morning of sampling and testing, he looked up from the handheld spectrometer with a furrowed brow. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "These readings, you got hydrocarbons present, crude ones, not surface seepage either. This stuff's down deep." Hank felt a strange mix of validation and unease. "How deep we talkin'?" he asked. Tom shrugged. "Hard to say without seismic, but if I had to guess, it's somewhere below 8,000 feet. You're sitting on a cap rock with a decent trap formation. Could be small, could be huge, but there's something down there." The silence that followed felt different, heavier. That afternoon, while Tom ran a few more checks, Hank drove his truck down to the Red Rock General Store to pick up supplies. The place was half empty, same as always, but it still served as the unofficial town square. He was just loading bags of feed into the bed when a voice called out behind him. "Well, I'll be damned, if it ain't Hank Morrison." He turned and squinted. The man walking toward him was grizzled and lean, with the gait of someone who'd been off solid ground for years. The years hadn't been kind, but Hank recognized the smile. "Jeb Colton." "In the flesh," Jeb said, grabbing Hank in a one-armed hug. They hadn't seen each other in nearly 30 years. Last time, they'd both been running rigs out in West Odessa, chasing black gold and drinking their wages faster than they earned them. "Heard from a guy at the diner that some old-timer bought up Elkhorn Ranch. Figured it couldn't be you. And yet..." "Guilty. You still in the business?" Jeb laughed. "Hell no. Retired after my liver threatened mutiny. Live just over in Crockett Ridge now. But let me tell you something. That land you bought..." He lowered his voice. "That place was drilled. Quietly. Back in '74. Hank froze. "What are you talking about?" "Independent outfit out of Amarillo. Real hush-hush. They came in under the radar, didn't even file most of their permits with the state. I was on a scout team. We mapped the terrain, drilled a few shallow wells, showed promise. But before anything big happened, they vanished. Packed up overnight. Rumor was they struck something too good, and someone paid them to walk away." Hank felt his heart rate climb. "You think they found a reservoir?" "I think they found enough to make someone nervous. Maybe even your daddy." That night, Hank dug through a trunk of old boxes he'd brought from his house in Red Rock. Inside a weathered folder marked Dad, Personal, he found it, a series of yellowed letters. Most were harmless correspondence with other farmers, a few receipts from the county office. But one envelope, unmarked, caught his eye. The letter inside was handwritten, dated September 1975. "To whom it may concern, I write this not for retribution, but for record. My name is James Morrison. For the past 6 months, I've observed unauthorized oil exploration on what was once public grazing land adjacent to Elkhorn Ranch. The operations have left no formal notice, no public filings. I believe valuable resources are being siphoned with no benefit to the community. I fear retaliation for speaking out, but I cannot remain silent. Attached is a map indicating the locations I have observed activity. Do with this what you will, no signature, just the initial JM. Hank stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling in his weathered hands. He pulled out the attached map, hand-drawn with familiar contours and red X's in places he had just walked with Tom. His father had known, and he had tried to speak out, but the silence that followed told Hank everything he needed to know. The letter had either been buried or ignored, and whatever quiet power had swept the truth under the rug back then might still be watching. The shadows of the past weren't just memory, they were still moving. Hank stepped outside, the cool wind raking over the dry land, rustling the weeds in long, whispering strokes. He looked out at Elkhorn Ranch, the crumbling fences and rusted gates, the cracked earth that had swallowed generations. Only now, he realized, some things never really got buried. Not when oil was involved, and not when someone like Hank Morrison was finally ready to dig. The first sign of trouble didn't come with flashing lights or a warning knock. It came in the form of a neatly folded legal notice taped to the front gate of the Elkhorn Ranch. Hank found it just after sunrise, paper curled from the early Texas heat, the official letterhead of West Petro Oil and Gas gleaming under the dew. He stood there for a long minute, jaw tight, eyes scanning the carefully worded threat, cloaked in corporate language. According to the notice, West Petro was claiming that a portion of the Elkhorn Ranch fell under a disputed boundary, categorized as public use land due to a clerical error dating back nearly 50 years. They accused Hank of unauthorized occupancy and warned of potential civil litigation unless the issue was amicably resolved. Hank knew exactly what that meant. The bastards wanted him to fold. He peeled the paper off the gate slowly and walked back toward the house, each step heavy with anger he hadn't felt since the funeral. He had fought weather, disease, and solitude over the years. But this was a different kind of storm, one wrapped in loopholes and smiling men in suits. That same afternoon, he drove into Red Rock and pulled up in front of a small adobe building with faded lettering. Miguel Chavez, attorney at law, serving Red Rock. Since 1982. Miguel had been friends with Hank's brother before Vietnam stole half a generation. A straight shooter with a razor-sharp mind, Miguel had turned down bigger jobs in Houston and Austin to keep helping folks in the dry corners of Texas, where justice was too often a matter of wealth, not truth. Miguel read the notice 3 times, his expression unchanging until the last line. "Well, they're not even being subtle," he said, tossing the paper onto his desk with disgust. "This is a pressure move, plain and simple, trying to force your hand." "They think I'll sell," Hank muttered. "They think you'll panic." Miguel reached into a filing cabinet, rummaged around until he pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the desk with a soft thud. "Let's see how well they've done their homework." Over the next 3 hours, they sifted through everything: the auction records, Hank's deed, county plats, mineral rights filings, even water use permits. Miguel was meticulous, highlighting inconsistencies, redlining loopholes before they could become snares. By the time the sun dipped low behind the courthouse dome, Miguel leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grunt. "Well, I'll be damned. You're clean. That sale was rock solid. Their claim? Garbage." He pointed at the notice. "This isn't about legality. It's about leverage." The next morning, a black SUV rolled onto the dusty road leading to Elkhorn. Hank stood on the porch, arms crossed, waiting as the driver's door opened and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. He was tall, trim, mid-40s maybe, with slicked back hair and aviator sunglasses that tried and failed to hide the condescension in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison," he said, climbing the steps with practiced ease, "I'm Craig Bensley, legal counsel for West Petro. I trust you received our notice." Hank nodded once. "I read it. Didn't say much." Bensley smiled, all teeth. "Sometimes less is more." There was a long pause between them, the kind of silence that said neither man had any interest in wasting time. "I'll get right to the point," Bensley continued. "West Petro would like to resolve this matter quickly and fairly. Given the current market value and potential legal complications, my client is prepared to offer you $100,000 for the Elkhorn Ranch." Hank's lip twitched. "You mean the ranch I paid $500 for?" "A tidy profit, I think you'll agree." "I think you should leave." Bensley chuckled, clearly used to pushback. "Come on, Mr. Morrison. You're not getting any younger. That land is just dirt and ghosts. Let us take it off your hands. You could live out your days in comfort." Hank took a step forward, voice like gravel. "That dirt and those ghosts? They're mine. Tell West Petro to come back with something real, if they've got the guts." Bensley hesitated, then pulled a business card from his pocket and laid it on the porch railing. "The offer stands for 7 days." He turned and left without another word. 3 days passed. Hank kept working, digging, clearing brush, keeping his hands moving so his mind wouldn't spiral. But each evening, he saw the same SUV parked just down the road, watching, waiting. On the 4th morning, a courier showed up with a new envelope. This time, the number inside wasn't 100,000, it was 250. Hank didn't open it. He lit it on fire in the kitchen sink. That night, Miguel drove out to the ranch, headlights sweeping across the long gravel drive. He brought fresh paperwork, formal rebuttals, preemptive injunction drafts, and a bottle of whiskey Hank hadn't seen since the war. "They're testing you," Miguel said, pouring 2 fingers neat, "seeing how far they can push before you break. They're wasting their time." Miguel raised his glass. "Then let's make them pay for it." Later that week, a deputy from the sheriff's office, an old friend named Russ, dropped by. Not in uniform, just jeans and a frayed work shirt. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Hank," Russ said, eyes scanning the horizon. "West Petro's been sniffing around the county clerk's office, digging through land records. They're asking about public easements, drainage maps, anything they can use. They'll find nothing but dust." Russ nodded, then lowered his voice. "You should know, they've hired a firm out of Houston. Real nasty bunch. If they can't buy you out, they'll try to bury you in paper." Hank leaned against the fence post. "Let 'em try. I've lived through things that make lawyers look like kittens." But as the sun set that evening, and the wind picked up across the plains, Hank felt something shift in the air, like the beginning of a storm no one could see yet, but that every farmer could feel deep in his bones. He walked to the edge of the property, where the cracked earth dropped into a shallow ravine that had once held water during spring runoff. The land was quiet, except for the creak of a windmill that hadn't turned in years. Beneath his boots, the dirt held its secrets, and Hank Morrison had no intention of letting anyone steal them again. Not this time. It started with the sharp crack of dry wood. Hank awoke in a jolt, the air around him unusually warm. For a moment, he thought it was just the suffocating heat of a Texas summer night, but the flicker of orange light dancing on the walls of his trailer told him otherwise. He shot up, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. The main house was on fire. Flames clawed at the brittle wooden siding, licking their way through the porch and into the front hall. The windows glowed with a furious light, the kind Hank had only seen once before during a wildfire that swept through Red Rock back in the 80s. But this was no act of nature. There had been no lightning, no freak electrical surge, no candles left burning. This felt different, too sudden, too deliberate. "God Almighty," he muttered, yanking on his boots and grabbing his phone. He sprinted across the dusty yard as fast as his 68-year-old legs could carry him, shouting into the phone as he went. "Red Rock Fire Department. It's Elkhorn Ranch. The main house is ablaze." By the time he reached the edge of the burning house, the front had collapsed inward with a deafening roar. Embers spun up into the sky, carried by the wind like glowing snowflakes. Hank could feel the searing heat against his skin even from several yards away. He knew there was no saving the building, but maybe, just maybe, he could save what mattered. He turned and bolted back toward the trailer where he'd set up his makeshift office. Inside, still panting, he flung open the file cabinet drawer and pulled out the black accordion folder marked Dad's Records, 1973 to 1977. The maps, the diagrams, the letters. He had made copies of everything. 2 days ago. After Dana Quinn's visit, a knot in his gut had urged him to prepare for the worst. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was just instinct honed from years of losing more than he'd ever kept. He grabbed the folder, stuffed it into his lockbox, and carried it outside just as the first fire engine crested the ridge. The firefighters worked through the night, but the house was unsalvageable. By dawn, it was a skeletal ruin of blackened beams and smoldering ash. Smoke still hung in the air like a fog of grief. Sheriff Clay Turner arrived just after sunrise, his cruiser kicking up dust as it rolled into the yard. He stepped out slowly, chewing on the stem of an unlit cigar. "Hank," he said, nodding solemnly. "You all right?" Hank stood by the shell of the porch, arms crossed, eyes tired. "Physically, sure. Everything else, not so much." Clay walked closer, his boots crunching over burnt debris. "You smell any gasoline?" Hank turned to face him. "You think it was arson?" The sheriff looked at the scorched earth, the way the fire had started on the porch and spread inward. "We'll let the fire marshal make the call, but I've seen enough barn fires and accidental blazes in my time. This one feels off." Hank nodded slowly. "I agree." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken suspicions pressing down between them. By late morning, the official investigation had begun. A team from the county fire department combed through the remains, snapping photos and collecting charred debris in evidence bags. One of them, a woman named Kelly Monroe, approached Hank near the remains of the sidewall. "Mr. Morrison, we found traces of an accelerant along the porch railing and front steps," she said. "Could be gasoline or diesel, but we'll need lab confirmation." "So it was arson," Hank said, jaw tightening. She gave a solemn nod. "That would be my bet." He turned away, eyes scanning what used to be his father's study. Gone now, just ashes and half-melted glass. But they hadn't gotten everything. Back inside his trailer, Hank sat at his small desk and opened the lockbox. Inside, the copied documents lay in perfect order, untouched by fire or smoke. Technical diagrams from the mid-70s, a folded oil company memo dated 1974, referencing unauthorized extractions, and, most crucially, a faded letter written in his father's hand. "To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, you've found what I couldn't stop. They took oil out of Elkhorn under false pretenses. West Tex Resources, never declared a barrel. I reported it. They shut me up." Hank traced the lines with his fingers. His father had tried, had raised the alarm, and someone had buried it, or burned it, until now. That afternoon, Miguel arrived. The lawyer's black SUV crunched to a stop outside the trailer, and he stepped out holding a manila folder. His eyes widened as he took in the damage. "Jesus, Hank, you all right?" "Been better." "Any idea who did it?" "Take your pick. Could be a warning. Could be West Petro deciding they're done negotiating." Miguel looked grim. "You sure you want to keep pushing this?" Hank didn't hesitate. "They burned my house down. I'm not backing off now." He handed Miguel the copies. Miguel flipped through them, his expression shifting from interest to alarm. "This is enough to open a formal investigation," he said. "That letter alone, if we can authenticate it, could lead to a civil suit, possibly even a criminal one." "Then let's get started." By sunset, the ruins of the house had gone cold, but in the sheriff's office, the incident was now logged as a suspected arson case. The state fire marshal had been notified, and in Miguel's downtown office, copies of the files had already been scanned, encrypted, and uploaded to secure cloud storage. If they were trying to silence Hank, they were already too late. And somewhere, in a corner office with a polished desk and a boardroom view, someone would soon realize that the fire they lit had only sparked something bigger, something they wouldn't be able to contain. The sun broke over Red Rock with a pale orange hue, casting long shadows across the desolate terrain of Elkhorn Ranch. Hank stood at the edge of the cratered pasture, his boots planted in dust that hadn't stirred in decades. The scars from the fire still lingered, charred remains of the main house, like blackened ribs, protruding from the earth. But beneath that scorched surface, he believed, something else simmered, something worth fighting for. "She's here," Tom called out from the porch of the old barn that somehow survived the blaze. A dusty blue Ford SUV rolled up the driveway. Out stepped a woman in her early 30s, dressed in jeans, steel-toed boots, and a weather-stained windbreaker with the logo of the West Texas Geological Institute. Elena Reyes carried herself with brisk confidence, a satchel slung over her shoulder and a tablet clutched under one arm. "Mr. Morrison," she greeted with a nod. Her voice was clear, efficient. "Glad you reached out. Tom tells me you found something that warrants a closer look." Hank gestured toward the rear pasture. "We need a real assessment. I think there's oil under this land. A lot of it." Elena raised an eyebrow. Well, let's find out. By mid-morning, the three of them were trudging across cracked soil, lugging portable seismic sensors and ground-penetrating radar gear. Elena set up her equipment with practiced ease, occasionally glancing at Hank with academic curiosity. The handheld scanner whirred to life, its screen glowing with colorful waves. "This place has history," she said, studying the display. "You know, I pulled some old field reports from the university archive. There's barely any data from this area, practically a blind spot. That's either coincidence or intentional." Tom spat tobacco off to the side. "I'd bet my last bottle of rye it was intentional." As the radar swept the land, anomalies began to show. Elena's brow furrowed. "These readings, they're consistent with a deep, trapped reservoir, and it's not just residual. This formation's still active." "Can you estimate volume?" Hank asked. "Not precisely, but from the structure and saturation patterns, we're talking millions of barrels. Maybe 5, conservatively." Tom let out a low whistle. Hank simply nodded, jaw tight. The validation didn't feel like victory. It felt like a warning. By evening, they were seated around Hank's campfire with printed seismic charts spread across a folding table. Elena traced lines across the diagram with a gloved finger. "This eastern shelf here," she said. "It's the sweet spot. It dips low and forms a natural trap. It's why it wasn't tapped out during those silent drills in the 70s. Your father might have suspected this." Hank glanced toward the barn, where salvaged crates from the fire still held remnants of his father's old maps. "He knew. I found letters, sketches. He tried to raise the alarm back then. Nobody listened." Tom's voice darkened. "Or they listened just enough to silence him." Elena closed her notebook. "If you're serious about protecting this site, we need legal cover and visibility. There are too many eyes watching now." 2 days later, Hank found himself standing in a meeting room inside the Red Rock County Courthouse. The air was stale. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. At the table sat County Commissioner Trudy Bennett, State Environmental Attorney Lloyd Keene, and a clerk with a stack of forms 2 inches thick. "You're saying West Petro tried to buy you out twice?" Bennett asked, squinting at the notes. "3 times, actually. Last offer was $250 cash. No questions asked." "And you believe they already knew about the reservoir?" Hank pushed a manila envelope across the table. Inside were seismic readings, Elena's preliminary analysis, and photocopies of his father's original letters dated 1972. "They've known for 50 years. They were just waiting for the paperwork to fall into the right hands." Keene flipped through the pages. His face tightened. "This changes things. If they attempted extraction without disclosure, there are multiple legal implications. Trespass, fraud, possibly environmental violations." "What I want," Hank said, voice even, "is a temporary injunction preventing any sale or drilling until this land's legal and geological history is reviewed." Bennett nodded. "We can initiate that. You understand this opens a can of worms. Better worms in daylight than snakes in the dark." That night, Hank stood again at the edge of the property, wind cutting sharp through his coat. The flames had long been extinguished, but the heat of conflict remained. A simple man with a battered past, an old ranch most had written off, and a truth buried deep in the dirt that could burn brighter than any oil fire. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He just wasn't willing to be the next man to look away. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They weren't just fighting for land anymore. They were fighting for legacy. And that kind of battle ran deeper than any drill ever could. The courthouse in Midland County wasn't used to national attention, but on a crisp Monday morning, reporters lined the sidewalk, camera crews jockeyed for angles, and locals filled every bench inside the aging brick building. The case of West Petro versus Hank Morrison had drawn eyes far beyond the dusty borders of Red Rock. What began as a dispute over a forgotten patch of desert had exploded into a legal battle that threatened to expose decades of corporate deception. Hank stood beside Miguel just outside the courthouse doors, adjusting the cuffs of a borrowed suit jacket that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. His hands, calloused from decades on the land, felt out of place in the polished wood-paneled hallways of the judicial system. But his eyes, steady, clear, and unwavering, belonged here more than any high-paid attorney in a tailored suit. "You sure about this?" Miguel asked, holding a thick binder of carefully assembled evidence. They're not just trying to win, Hank. They're trying to crush you. Make an example. Hank gave a slow nod. Then let 'em try. The courtroom buzzed as West Petro's legal team filed in like a small army, led by Malcolm Prentice, a silver-haired litigator with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Opposing him stood Miguel, flanked by interns and volunteers from the regional legal clinic, and Hank, solid, silent, unbending. Judge Rowena Thistlewood entered with practiced authority. Her reputation for fairness was well known in Texas legal circles, but even she looked mildly surprised at the scale of what had become a David versus Goliath spectacle. Case number 8743, West Petro Energy Corporation versus Hank Morrison, the bailiff announced. Allegations of unlawful obstruction of critical infrastructure development. Prentice rose smoothly. Your Honor, the defendant has, through intentional inaction and deliberate delay, impeded a project deemed essential by both the state and energy sector for regional growth and energy independence. Miguel countered calmly. The defendant legally acquired the property at a county auction. His refusal to sell does not constitute obstruction. It is his right as a property owner under both state and federal law. Let's proceed, the judge said, and let's keep this civil. We are not here to referee a land war. We are here to examine legal merit. The first 2 days were a blur of documents, testimony from West Petro's land acquisition team, and economic impact projections designed to paint Hank as a selfish obstructionist standing in the way of public good. The corporation's narrative was clear, one old man clinging to dusty memories, blocking energy progress and regional prosperity. But on day 3, Miguel changed the game. He introduced historical records, scanned copies of handwritten letters, geological surveys, and internal memos. Some salvaged from the burned ranch house, others acquired through the Freedom of Information Act. The centerpiece was a 1974 letter from Hank's father, Earl Morrison, addressed to the Texas Department of Natural Resources. It detailed unauthorized drilling, concealed extraction volumes, and collusion between a now-defunct shell company and the original West Petro executives. This wasn't just land, Miguel said, voice rising with emotion. This was theft, committed under cover of drought, foreclosure, and bureaucratic neglect, and it's happening again. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Hank was called to the stand. He took his time walking to the witness box, pausing to glance at the jury. They were a mix of teachers, mechanics, retirees, people who understood land, work, and the price of silence. Mr. Morrison, Prentice began, you declined offers of $50,000, $100,000, even $250,000 for land you paid $500 for. Is that correct? Yes. Why? Because it's not about money. Then what is it about? Hank's voice was low but firm. It's about history, about a man who worked this land and lost everything because some suits figured no one would notice. About a town tired of being told what's good for it by people who don't live here, don't bleed here. He held up a scorched map, the geological chart his father had drawn by hand. My dad knew there was something here. He tried to do the right thing. They buried his voice under paperwork. I ain't letting that happen again. The jurors didn't move. Even Prentice was briefly without words. By the final day of trial, national media had picked up the story. An editorial in the Dallas Chronicle compared Hank's battle to modern-day frontier justice. Social media was ablaze with hashtag #StandWithHank, and an anonymous source within West Petro leaked internal emails suggesting knowledge of the oil reserves long before Dana Quinn showed up at Hank's door. In closing arguments, Miguel kept it simple. This case isn't just about oil. It's about ownership, truth, and who gets to decide the future of small-town America. One man's voice stood up to $1 billion machine. That matters. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Hank Morrison had not obstructed anything. He had exercised his legal rights, and West Petro's tactics were to be referred for federal review under suspicion of fraud and corporate misconduct. Gasps filled the courtroom. Prentice sat back, expression unreadable. Miguel exhaled sharply. And Hank? He just nodded once. Outside, reporters swarmed. The courthouse steps became a stage, but Hank stayed quiet, letting Miguel speak. That night, back at Elkhorn Ranch, under a sky painted in stars and desert wind, Hank sat alone in the old barn, a mug of coffee in his hands. Justice, it turned out, didn't come cheap. But it came. And in Red Rock, folks would remember the day one old farmer reminded the world that land, history, and honor were worth more than oil ever could be. The morning sun rose over Elkhorn Ranch, casting a golden hue across the freshly turned soil and the dew-kissed blades of tall grass. It was the kind of morning that didn't just signal a new day, it signaled a new era. For decades, this land had been a ghost story whispered in the corners of Red Rock. Now, it stood reborn, not just in name or ownership, but in spirit. Where the old farmhouse once stood in ruins, a new building had been erected. Not a home, but a heartbeat. The Morrison Community Center wasn't flashy. Its walls were cedar, reclaimed from a nearby mill. Its roof sloped modestly, outfitted with solar panels. Inside, the rooms were filled with purpose. Classrooms for agricultural training, offices for environmental research, a kitchen that served lunch to kids from all over the county. And at the very center of it all, a wall lined with photographs. Ellie Morrison smiling in the sunlight, Walter Morrison drilling beside a younger Hank, snapshots of the land's past, stitched now into its present. Hank stood alone on the back porch of the center, holding a chipped mug of black coffee. The wind rustled the wheat he'd replanted behind the barn, and a flock of starlings wheeled across the sky like ink spilled in slow motion. Somewhere off in the distance, the hum of a wind turbine blended with the soft clatter of kids arriving for morning programs. It was quiet. Not the eerie kind of quiet that used to haunt the ranch, but a contented, settled kind. The kind of quiet you get after a storm finally passes. The oil well sat a quarter-mile away, fenced in and managed by a third-party company that operated under the strictest environmental regulations in the state. Not a single tree had been felled without replanting 3 more. Elena, the young geologist who'd once walked the land with a skeptical eye, was now leading a project with the local university to study the land's ecological regeneration. She told Hank last week that Elkhorn was quickly becoming a benchmark case for responsible rural development. Hank didn't pretend to understand all the science. What he did understand was the pride that surged in his chest every time he saw a teenager learning to irrigate a plot without draining the aquifer, or when a mother from town thanked him for the job the center had given her son. Inside the main hall, a plaque hung above the fireplace. For Ellie and Walter Morrison, the ones who dug deep and held fast. In the months since the trial, West Petro had quietly slinked back into its glass towers. Investigations were still ongoing. Some executives had resigned to spend time with family. The media storm had waned, but its impact lingered like smoke. More importantly, landowners across Texas had started to organize, creating cooperatives, pooling legal resources, demanding transparency. Miguel, now something of a folk hero in the land rights world, had been invited to speak before the state legislature. And Tom, grumpy, sharp-witted Tom, had taken to giving weekend tours to curious families and students. He knew the land like the back of his hand, and his stories about fault lines and underground pockets of pressure had become local legend. Kids adored him, especially when he told them the land had good ghosts. "It ain't haunted," he'd say, tapping the side of his nose. "It's just remembered." One particular afternoon, Hank sat beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree, watching a group of kids plant native grasses along the ridge. Sarah, now the full-time coordinator of the center's education program, came over and handed him a folder. "Applications for the Morrison Trust scholarships just hit record numbers," she said, her eyes gleaming. "We've got submissions from 4 counties now." Hank opened the folder, flipping through essays scrawled in eager handwriting. "You see this one here?" he said, pointing at an essay from a high schooler in Pecos. "Her family's been farming onions since the Dust Bowl, wants to study soil restoration. That's full circle right there." Sarah smiled. "You made this possible, Hank." He shook his head. "Number I just stopped long enough to listen. The land did the rest." That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the courtyard lit up with lanterns and string lights for the community's first harvest night, a celebration of renewal. There was music, banjos, fiddles, guitars, and enough food to feed a small army. Hank stood quietly near the edge of the festivities, nodding to neighbors, soaking in the laughter, the dance, the life that had returned to Elkhorn. Nearby, a polished stone caught the last rays of the sun. It read simply, "In memory of Ellie and Walter Morrison, for the roots they planted." A little girl in braids tugged at Hank's sleeve. "Mr. Hank," she asked, "is it true you found treasure under the ground?" Hank smiled. "Sort of. Like gold?" "No," he said, glancing around at the lights, the people, the land. "Better." Later that week, as he stood on the ridge behind the ranch, a camera crew from a public broadcasting station asked if he'd like to say a few words for their feature on rural revitalization. He looked at the camera and spoke plainly. This land was broken, not just from what was taken out of it, but from what was never given back. I spent most of my life thinking the best thing I could do was leave the past buried. But turns out some things are worth digging up. Some things are worth standing your ground for. He paused, then added with a dry chuckle, "And if you're lucky, sometimes that ground fights for you right back." The closing shot was of Hank, alone at dawn, walking the fence line of Elkhorn Ranch with a dog at his heels and a rising sun at his back. Not a wealthy man, not a politician or preacher, but something quieter, steadier, a steward of the land, a keeper of history, a farmer who unearthed more than oil. He unearthed hope. Sometimes the loudest stories don't begin with a bang. Sometimes they begin with a man stepping out of an old pickup truck, standing alone on cracked soil, looking out at a ranch everyone else had long forgotten. Hank Morrison didn't set out to make headlines. He didn't come to Elkhorn Ranch for riches or fame or some kind of legacy. He came because something inside him was still unfinished, a quiet ache that only silence, wide skies, and open land could answer. But what started as a personal journey, a way to reckon with grief, memory, and a lifetime of work, became something more. A ranch long believed to be worthless turned out to be sitting atop a secret buried for decades. $1 million oil reserve, covered up by powerful hands, erased from maps, and nearly burned from existence. Hank could have taken the money. He could have signed on the dotted line, handed over the keys, and walked away with a comfortable retirement. But he didn't, because he remembered what mattered. He remembered the kind of man his father was, the kind who believed land was more than property. It was a promise that what we build, what we grow, what we leave behind, should mean something. And so, Hank stood his ground. He faced corporate lawyers and thinly veiled threats. He watched his family home burn, saw his quiet life turned upside down. But with every challenge, he found unexpected allies: Miguel, Tom, Elena, Sophie from the scholarship fund, even Sheriff Clay Turner. People who still believed in right and wrong. People who believed that truth, no matter how old or buried, deserved to come to light. In the end, Hank didn't just win a court case. He reclaimed a future. He turned Elkhorn Ranch from a forgotten patch of earth into a living story, one that feeds, teaches, and empowers the next generation. The oil didn't just become revenue, it became restoration. Restoration of schools, of jobs, of broken systems. The land gave back, but only because someone chose not to take from it blindly. And maybe that's the lesson here, that there's still power in standing firm when the world tells you to move. That dignity can grow in dry soil. That when we dig with honesty, we might just strike something more valuable than we ever imagined. Not oil, not gold, but a legacy worth leaving. So if this story moved you, if Hank's fight reminded you of your own grandparents, or your father's calloused hands, or your town's fading history, then I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me what this story meant to you. Tell me what your Elkhorn Ranch is. Maybe it's not land. Maybe it's a family business, a forgotten neighborhood, a dream that everyone else told you to give up on. Whatever it is, I hope this story gave you a reason to hold on. And if you believe there are more stories like Hank's out there, hidden in barns, tucked into old journals, passed down in whispers between generations, then stick around. This channel is just getting started. Every week, we bring you real, emotional stories from the heart of rural America. Stories of resilience, of mystery, of people who stood up when no one else would. From abandoned farms and dusty towns to courtroom battles and long-lost legacies, there's always another story waiting just beneath the surface. So please, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next tale that just might stay with you long after the credits roll. And share this video. Not for clicks or likes, but because someone out there might need to be reminded that no matter how small you feel, how forgotten you think you are, your story still matters. We'll see you in the next one. And as always, from the back roads of Red Rock to wherever you're watching from, thanks for being here. Stay rooted, stay real, and never stop digging. We'll see you in the next story.